This study found that for the same habit to be formed, it can take anywhere from 18 days to as many as 254 days for different individuals to form that habit. And a lot of habit formation has to do with being in the right state of mind and being able to control your state of body and mind. For those of you that just want to be more habitual about certain things, be able to perform certain things more reflexively that you would like in your life, simply take the time, do it once, maybe twice, and just sit down, close your eyes if you like, and just step through the procedure of what it's going to take in order to perform that habit. So the program I'm about to describe, I formulated for you based on the neuroscience literature and the psychology literature of learning and this concept of task bracketing. It involves dividing the 24-hour days into what I call 3 phases. The first is phase 1, which is 0 to 8 hours after waking up, approximately. Okay, you can put a plus or minus 30 minutes on this for yourself. The second phase is the 9 to 14, maybe 15 hours after you wake up. And the third phase is 16 to 24 hours after waking up. So we've taken the 24-hour cycle, we've carved it up into 3 phases, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. Now, everything I'm describing, or at least the way I'm going to describe it, is based on what I would call a typical schedule, diurnal schedule. You've heard of nocturnal? Well, we are diurnal. Most of us are asleep at night and awake during the day. I do realize that a number of people have shift work or they have newborns or other reasons why they have to be up in the middle of the night and sleeping during the day. But most people go to sleep somewhere around 10 p.m., plus or minus 2 hours, and wake up sometime around 7 a.m., plus or minus 2 hours. So today I'm going to use the to bed at 10 p.m. and the wake up time of 7 a.m. as the framework for this, but you could adopt it easily to your particular schedule. Phase 1, which again is 0 to 8 hours after waking, has a particular neurochemical signature. Regardless of what you do, the neuromodulators norepinephrine, as well as epinephrine, so that's noradrenaline and adrenaline, as well as the neuromodulator dopamine, tend to be elevated during that first 0 to 8 hours after waking. And there are several things that perhaps we should all be doing. I've talked about many of these on the podcast before, that in addition to those chemicals, further support an alert and focused state. The sunlight, exercise, cold exposure, caffeine, tyrosine, etc., all of those place the brain and body into a state in which you are better able, or I would say more easily able, to engage in activities that have a high degree of limbic friction and where you need to override that limbic friction, right? We've heard that the morning is kind of sacred, conquer the hardest things first thing in the morning. And that's been discussed in the pop psychology literature and in the habit formation literature, merely from the perspective of get it out of the way so you can feel good about having done it. But what I'm referring to is quite different. What I'm referring to is a particular phase of day that after rising, after waking up that is, for 0 to 8 hours, right, in that first phase, your whole system is action and focus oriented. And we know that when you are action and focus oriented, and because of the neurochemicals that are naturally released into your brain and body, that you will be more likely to overcome any limbic friction that stands in the way of performing particular habits. So as you list out or think about the various habits that you'd like to adopt in your life, take the habits for which you know there's the highest degree of limbic friction. They are the hardest for you to engage in. They require the most activation energy, and put those in this 0 to 8 hours after waking. This will greatly facilitate your performance of those new habits. I'm certain of that. And in addition to that, by doing them in this particular phase of the day, not necessarily at the same time. I mean, if you want to be very habitual and you want to do, the exercise or the sunlight viewing always at the same time, or you want to do, you want to drink your caffeine always at the exact same time, that's fine. But by placing them in this broader window of 0 to 8 hours after waking, what you're doing is you're creating task bracketing. You're making it such that your nervous system will predict when you are going to lean in against limbic friction in order to perform particular types of habits. And this is very different than saying, I'm always going to run or I'm always going to study from 10 to 12 a.m. every morning. That's great. And if you can do that, terrific. But the literature indicates that people who do that, who are very rigid about when they do things, tend because of context dependence, to not necessarily stick to those habits over time. Some people do, but many, many people don't. So think about the hardest habits to form and the habits that you most want to form that are hardest for you to adopt and to maintain. And I highly suggest placing those somewhere within this phase 1 of 0 to 8 hours after waking. So what I'm referring to as phase 1 of each day is useful for acquiring certain habits. But there are other phases of the day, and those turn out to be useful for acquiring other types of habits. Phase 2, as I mentioned, is about, again, these aren't specifics, but about 9 to 14 or 15 hours after waking. During this phase of the day, because of the circadian shifts in our biology, the amount of dopamine and norepinephrine that's circulating in our brain and bloodstream tends to start to come down, and levels of cortisol tend to start to come down. That's the ideal circumstance. So 9 to 14 hours after waking, dopamine and norepinephrine and cortisol are starting to taper down just naturally. And a different neuromodulator, serotonin, is starting to rise. Serotonin is definitely going to be highest in this second half of the day and tends to lend itself to a more relaxed state of being. Now, of course, I do realize that some people are less of morning people and find that they really come alive and awake in the afternoon, but most people don't fall into that category. Most people feel more alert early in the day, even anxious early in the day, and then as the afternoon progresses, they tend to be a bit more sleepy, a bit more relaxed, a bit more calm. There are certain things that we all can and should do during this phase 2 of each day that lend themselves to a state of mind and a state of body that is going to be beneficial for the generation and consolidation of certain types of habits. What are those things? First of all, as the day goes on, you should try, if you can, to start tapering the amount of light that you're viewing. Now, this doesn't mean putting yourself into dim light at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. That's certainly not the case. Simply that you want to start tapering off the amount of really bright light that you're getting, unless it's sunlight. Viewing the sun as it's at what we call low solar angle, so as it's headed toward the horizon. You don't necessarily have to watch the sunset, although that can be nice. But getting some sunlight in your eyes in the second half of the day can also be beneficial for a number of brain systems and psychological systems. So you can get some sunlight in your eyes. You can certainly have artificial lights on, but you want to start dimming those lights and bringing them actually physically lower in the room, because the neurons in your eye that view the upper visual field, they actually trigger this alertness mechanism in the brain and body. And in the second half of the day, even if you're humming around and doing work at 3 and 4 or 5 or even 7 p.m., you are probably headed towards sleep a few hours later. So things like limiting the total amount of light if you can, things like heat and sauna, hot baths, hot showers, those are terrific things to do in the second half of the day. They tend to support this serotonergic or high serotonin-like state and lend themselves to more calm and relaxation. Basically, this phase 2 of the day is one in which you're alert, you are present, you are working, you are engaging socially, you're cooking dinner, probably paying attention to a number of things, but you should really be trying to taper off your stress level. So how do you leverage phase 2 of the day for habit formation? Well, given what we know about the neurochemistry of learning and memory, given what we know about task formation and its reliance on certain forms of neuroplasticity, the second half of the day is a terrific time to take on habits and things that you're already doing that require very little override of limbic friction. So these might be things that you could categorize in common terms as kind of mellower activities. It might be journaling. It might be that you already are performing music, or I should say practicing music regularly, but that there's a particular type of music that is hard for you, or that you're working on a particular piece of music, or you're trying to learn a language, something that's a little bit challenging, but doesn't require a ton of energy in order to override that limbic friction. The second half of the day is a much better time to do that, less resistance, as we might say. But of course, resistance has a neural substrate. And the reason for doing those things in the second part of the day, the so-called phase 2, as I've called it, part of the day, is because your ability to override resistance is really diminished in this second phase of the day. Some of you might say, well, wait, I like to exercise in the second half of the day. That's actually when I have the most energy. That's when I feel warmer. I'm not a morning exerciser. That's absolutely fine. But what I'm referring to is the acquisition of new behaviors and placing those consistently at the second half of the day in order to engage this task bracketing mechanisms that I talked about before. One of the hallmark features of those basal ganglia circuits for go and no-go is that they are associated with certain neurochemicals, dopamine and serotonin, acetylcholine, and other neurochemicals. And by placing particular habits at particular phases of the day, those neurochemical states start to be associated with the leaning in and the process of beginning and, as I mentioned, ending those particular habits. And in doing so, they shift the whole nervous system toward being able to predict that certain things are going to happen at particular times of day, that you're going to be leaning very hard against limbic friction early in the day in phase one, and that you're going to be doing things that require less conscious override of limbic friction in phase two. And in doing so, set up this task bracketing system so that the individual habits that you're learning or that you're trying to learn have a much greater probability of being executed and consolidated, meaning that pretty soon they will just naturally become reflexive. Phase three of the 24-hour schedule runs from about 16 to 24 hours after waking. During that period of time, there are a few things that are going to support being in a state of mind, state of body, that are going to allow neuroplasticity to occur, that are going to allow the rewiring that you've triggered during the waking part of the day to actually take place. Those things are very low to no light, and keeping the room temperature low is very beneficial for getting and staying in deep sleep. The body has to drop by about 1 to 3 degrees in order to get into sleep and to stay asleep. So low light, low temperature environment. Typically, people aren't eating in the middle of the night, although one thing that can be useful is to make sure that you're at least well fed enough when you head into this third phase of every 24-hour day that you're not awake because you're hungry. But again, phase three is really about making sure that whatever limbic friction you've been able to override in phase one and trigger some new habit, right? Forcing yourself to write or forcing yourself to study or forcing yourself to exercise during that high limbic friction state. And then whatever things you've been doing in phase two, which are habits that hopefully have moved a little bit further along the continuum of newly formed versus all the way to reflexive, or things that take less limbic friction in order to do. Phase three is when all of that gets really locked into the nervous system through those heavy-in mechanisms like NMDA receptors, et cetera, that I talked about before. Again, neuroplasticity is the basis of habit formation, and neuroplasticity and the rewiring of neural circuits happens in these states of deep sleep. So if you're not obeying this phase three, if you're not giving phase three the materials it needs, and you're not avoiding the certain things like caffeine and bright light and stress during phase three, you're simply not going to be able to build those habits that you've been working so hard to trigger in phase one and phase two of the day.